Okay, good afternoon, Dad.
Good afternoon.
Today is Wednesday, April 23rd, and what
Yeah.
do you want to talk about?
We can talk about the world.
All right, what's
About
going on in the world?
yeah, well, important negotiations, or maybe actually the absence of negotiations going on in London. Yeah, I guess the second one is in Oman. I'm not sure actually where the second one is being held. I'm talking about the Iranian American negotiations, but the Omanis again are serving as mediators wherever it's being held. Maybe first we'll talk about the London meeting that was supposed to occur. It seems to have fallen apart. I don't know if it's even going to happen now. Originally it was going to be Secretary of State Rubio and the foreign ministers of France, and I guess he calls the foreign secretary in the UK, uh, Lamy. They were supposed to be there, with a Ukrainian representative, and they were supposed to. That's where the Americans were going to present and try to gain the approval of the other participants to their peace plan. There's kind of their ceasefire plan, and but at the last minute, Rubio pulled out, and then the foreign ministers pulled out, and they said, "Well, we're going to go ahead with it, but it's going to be lower level." And I'm not even sure if they're doing that. It seems to be falling apart, and the Americans appear to be pinning the blame on Zelensky for this. In fact, I think it was just a matter of like half an hour ago or so that Trump commented on Truth Social that it was like, Zelensky doesn't want peace. He was clearly pinning the blame on him. So we'll see. Of course, the threat was made that if, in fact, either side did not accept this, that the Americans would just walk away. They would just wash their hands of the whole conflict. And we'll see what that means. So they're going to just cut off all funds and military supplies. Are they going to attempt to cut off, the supplies that were agreed to under Biden? Or are they just going to wait for that to run out and not replenish them? We'll have to see.
So this negotiation in London, who was involved? Was this involving the Russians as well? Was this
No,
really supposed to be high level? So this was just internally within the
yeah,
Western Europeans and the Americans
and the Ukrainians.
and the Ukrainians.
Okay. The idea was that, okay, we'll get together and we'll agree on what we're going to offer to the Russians. And then, and there have been a lot of leaks. It's just been in all kinds of different media outlets. We've been hearing about what this plan entailed. So I think that we can be pretty confident what in fact it did entail. It was a U.S. recognition of Crimea as Russian territory. That was part of it, and then basically a ceasefire along the present lines of contact. But I think the Russians would actually have to withdraw from Kharkov and from Sumy. And so they would simply keep what they have so far in Lugansk, Donetsk, Kherson, and Zaporozhye, but they wouldn't get the entirety, of those regions. They do have the pretty much like 99.8% of Lugansk, but they don't have. They still have a ways to go on the other three regions, and they, according to this plan, they wouldn't get it. And then, but very importantly, Ukraine would never become a member of NATO. That's what's been leaked. Um, so that's the outline of the plan. If we can believe these leaks, and I think we can, they've been pretty consistent. Um, Now, this falls. This is better than the so-called Kellogg plan. I've heard this described as the Kellogg plan, but I think that's really not accurate. I went back and looked at the Kellogg plan, and it actually didn't go this far. It didn't, um, for example, include the recognition of Crimea, and it offered. Okay, well, I guess sanctions relief was going to be another part of this plan. It did offer the possibility of sanctions relief, but most likely after the negotiations occurred following the ceasefire, and if those negotiations led to an agreement with Ukraine, then Russia could see sanctions relief. So it really was. and no promise of a permanent NATO non-membership. So this actually goes beyond the Kellogg plan, in significant ways. So if you want to call it Kellogg Plus or something, but it was more than the Kellogg plan, but still far short of what the Russians have been demanding and have been, repeatedly, at all levels, not just Putin, but Peskov and Lavrov and everybody of importance in the establishment has been, singing from the same hymn book, so to speak. They've been very, very consistent. They've made it very, very clear. And they've even said, no, these are not negotiable. These are not, our maximalist positions. These are our basic requirements that have to be met. So if the Russians, in fact, accepted that, that would be, a real reversal. It would be quite a surprise, and I think it would be very, very unpopular in Russia. There was a story in the Financial Times just a couple of days ago that claimed that the Russians had agreed to this, secretly. Peskov was asked about it, and he denied it. He said that's just false news. Interestingly, Gilbert Doctorow, who spends a lot of time in Russia and follows Russian news in Russian. So, he should have a feeling for what's possible and what's not. He seems to believe that that's real, that the Russians or Putin actually agreed to it. But he also admitted that would be very, very unpopular in Russia. So I think it's unlikely that Putin agreed to it. Maybe you could look at it as like maybe the Russians implied that they might, because they knew that the Ukrainians would reject it, and when the Ukrainians rejected it, then it, of course, they would be blamed for the failure, and that appears to be what's happening.
Okay, interesting. Right. So the Russians, you feel like they're not really have any wiggle room for negotiations. I mean, they're in the driver's seat. There's no reason for them to can make any concessions, right?
Right. Yeah.
So
it was right.
So I mean, the issue is just that the West just can't even get together to even propose a plan that will automatically be rejected by the Russians anyways, right? I think they're just trying to get some kind of starting point, right, to begin the process, but it seems like we can't even get to that process. So what does that mean about just our relationship with our allies, or what is happening in terms of just the NATO and this firm Western alliance, this bloc, this Western world order that we have?
Yeah, well, there quite clearly is, a split, essentially between the U.S. and the rest of NATO. Again, with the exceptions of Hungary and Slovakia, of course. Though I don't think you could describe this as a process. This has been presented as like basically an ultimatum. I think Peskov chose not to describe it as an ultimatum, but I think it basically was an ultimatum. The idea was, okay, this is the final offer. They were going to hammer it, get the approval in London, and then present it to the Russians. And then if the Russians didn't accept it, from comments that both Rubio and Trump have made, that would be the end of it. If the Russians rejected it, then there would be no more peace process. So, but we didn't get to that point. It hasn't even been offered to the Russians because the Ukrainians refused to approve it, which, by the way, I think was very foolish on their part. I mean, I think they should have had every reason to believe that the Russians would reject it, and they could have been the good guys, and not one of those horrible people that Trump was describing, or that he, and he. In his talk about this ultimatum, he says, well, you're horrible people, and we're just not going to deal with this anymore. So now it is the Ukrainians who are horrible people. But the Ukrainians, if they played it smart, I think they could have made the Russians the horrible people. But anyway, this was going to be the end of the peace process, which I find all very, very strange. This is not the way that treaties are usually hammered out. We've had this back and forth. We've had some meetings in places like Riyadh or in Jeddah, and uh, and then we've had Witkoff go to Moscow and St. Petersburg, and we had Dmitriev, visit Witkoff and probably Trump too in Washington D.C. And you would think that this was all adding up to something. It was supposed to be the beginning of a real negotiation process, and in a real negotiation process, both sides, they put together teams of experienced negotiators and they start hammering it out. That never really happened. We had these visits and we had these statements, and then we have this ultimatum. And the ultimatum is clearly far short of what the Russians have been demanding, which Witkoff himself, remember, not too long ago, maybe it was just a couple of weeks ago, he said that, the Russians, we really should just recognize those territories, those 4 territories. And this clearly falls short of that. There's that. And then, there's clearly is a split. It was, even if, this meeting had gone ahead, and even if, let's say the Ukrainians had relented and approved of it, it was clear that the Europeans did not want to go along with it. They said that we will not recognize Crimea. Okay, the U.S. would just have to recognize Crimea. That would be something. But the Europeans said they won't, and we're not offering sanctions relief. Okay, the Americans, they can lift some sanctions, but we're not doing that. It was never going to be a united front.
So what now? Are we going to be able to walk away? Will Trump be able to do that? It almost seems like this is just causing the whole Western Europe and U.S. just to disintegrate. This whole, prior to this invasion, the NATO alliance, in my mind, I think in minds of most everybody around the world, was the most powerful military alliance in the world. But that's just, I feel, been completely shattered by this. And it's not even, this is a proxy, a NATO proxy, essentially. But this NATO proxy, to me, feels like it's breaking apart the Western alliance, NATO, this permanent fixture in my mind that was always there. Do you feel like that's what's happening?
Yeah, well, initially, actually NATO themselves and many of the supporters of, Ukraine were saying, this has been great for NATO. And the first couple of years under Biden has drawn us together with, we've brought new members in, Finland and Sweden. This has made NATO stronger than ever and NATO more united than ever. But now it's, of course, looking very differently. First you did have Hungary and Slovakia break away, but those are, relatively minor countries. But now the U.S., and the U.S. is essentially, NATO cannot survive with the U.S. And you have an administration that is clearly just not interested in supporting this war. They may end up doing it for various reasons that we've talked about. They just might end up doing it. They might find, but Trump clearly doesn't want to support this war. He doesn't like it, but he's inherited it, and he may just, for reasons of face, he doesn't want to be the loser, the guy who lost the war, and because it's just the pressures that he's going to be subjected to, he might end up supporting it and just actually carrying forward Biden's policies. But clearly he doesn't want to. I think he may actually attempt to walk away from it. We'll see if he really can.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it makes me think that these alliances that we have, that we build, our so-called greatest allies, it's really just all on paper. But at the end of the day, when real interests are put to the test, then it doesn't really mean that much. Now, I always had this idea that NATO was, every time it added a new member, I was like, man, it's getting more and more powerful. But in reality, it's becoming weaker and weaker, especially as you add smaller and smaller nations. Like if we eventually got Georgia into NATO, how would that be great for NATO? All of a sudden, you have, tensions in maybe a small country that you expect the rest of your alliance to take on and absorb. It's doomed to fail. I feel like a proselytizing alliance can never really work. It has to be a genuine agreement, kind of like what we see happen between Russia and Iran, or China and Russia. they understand their needs for their nation and how they can mutually benefit each other. They don't overextend. There seems to be no desire anywhere else in the world to have some type of military alliance that is continually growing. And you have this, I mean, that's why World War I started, this entangling alliances. And that's what basically NATO is, right? It's doomed to fail, I feel like. If the Ukraine situation didn't happen, it would just be another situation. Maybe the Serbs get a little crazy with the Croats or something, and then it blows up again. Or Kosovo does something, you know?
Right. Yeah, no, it's, people have made that argument for years now, that it's been a mistake, this continual expansion of NATO. It doesn't actually strengthen NATO. A lot of these new countries are really liabilities rather than assets for the reasons that you've given. They could be the trigger that starts a war. They bring very little to the alliance, but they could be the cause of a war, where the other countries are obligated to come into their support. So, yeah, I don't think NATO has been very rational. I think you could say the same thing about EU. There's this kind of focus on expansion. It's kind of like maybe analogous to a church that's always focusing on proselytizing and bringing in new members and not actually providing spiritual nourishment to the members that they have. So you see some of that. A lot of it. Again, NATO looked very, very powerful on paper. But we're finding out that these countries, I think probably because for such a long time, that there really wasn't any serious threat of war. Just like the military-industrial complex in this country, there were a lot of corrupt practices became established. Nobody's really thinking about war, but everybody's thinking about money, about lining their own pockets. And that happened in Europe just as much as it's happened here in this country. So, when actually a real war broke out, we found out that they really didn't have very many weapons. And a lot of these weapons were maybe very impressive, when they were demonstrated at these arms expos or whatever. But in a real war, they're just not very effective. There was a very interesting, it was actually a study done by the Bundeswehr, which is the German military, and it was released in one of the major German magazines. But they had done a very careful analysis of how German equipment had performed in the Ukraine war, and what they found was that that their performance was very disappointing. The main thing is that these things were very expensive. That's a problem, and then they just they're delicate. They break down quickly. And then when they break down, they're very, very difficult to repair and maintain. And this is something that we had been saying earlier, but it's good to find, a study actually done, by a NATO member that reached the same conclusion. So there's a lot of things, like just over time, they were so separated from the reality. Again, it was just about making bucks. And so you created weapons that, again, we're very impressive at these shows where you could get these contracts, but they don't really prove very useful in a real war. That's what we're finding, and that's what we're finding about NATO in general.
Right. Yeah, I hear the U.S. On the news when there's a spokesperson talking about, they use the term "our allies" all the time, like our allies across the globe, our allies, but I just feel like we don't really have allies. We say we have allies, but I'm getting this feeling that we don't really have friends anymore. Do you think there's any truth to that? Yeah. Like, what are our real allies? Do we have real assets? And should we seek allies? I mean, I feel like we should just seek better relations with the other superpowers, with Russia, with China, with Iran, instead of siding with, okay, we got Finland now. All right, China, you're in trouble. I don't know what the idea is, but
right. Yeah. The problem with alliances, true military alliances that involve mutual defense pacts. If one of us gets attacked, then we got to go to the aid of the others. That these alliances become entangling, right? And that's obviously the risk. So the more so-called allies they have, actually, the greater the risk that something could go wrong. You've made all these promises to different countries, and you don't know, really what these countries are doing. A lot of times, it was the case in Georgia in 2008. Georgia had been designated a future member of NATO, and they launched a war against against Russia, killed Russian peacekeepers back in 2008. You can, a lot of times these smaller countries have an incentive. Their incentive, the way they look at it is very different. They say, wow, we joined this great alliance. Now we have this 800-pound gorilla at our back. Now we can act tough with Russia or, whatever country. And they become very irresponsible. Without the so-called alliance, they would probably be very, very much more cautious, much more willing to, negotiate with Russia, for example. But with the 800-pound gorilla at their back, they can be extremely reckless, and you can actually encourage war, rather than prevent it, rather than deter attacks. You can actually, spark a real war. So that's the dangers. Now, whether or not we have real allies, well, it's kind of hard to say right now. I think up through Biden, it was just sort of, at least through
on paper.
Inertia. But these are old alliances that are just kind of built into the institutions and of Europe, and actually all these people, like the presidents of European countries, the European Commission, they were firmly embedded within U.S.-led global hegemony. That was their understanding. So they did see themselves, you could say allies, or maybe just or as perhaps vassal states, some of us who are take a more jaundiced view of them might say. But I think it was real, at least at that institutional level. Those ties were really very, very strong. Now, I don't think it was to their benefit. I mean, that's what, again, people like Viktor Orban or whatever said, that no, it just makes much more sense for us, instead of being part of this league of nations, we should try to maintain relations with all countries of the world, but now under Trump, those institutional ties have really come under strain. That's what we're seeing. And so that the alliance has suffered real damage. The U.S.-European alliance, that is the core of what NATO is all about. That's why we call it the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, because it's transatlantic. But that's been put. It hasn't broken, but it's been put under a tremendous amount of strain, and it remains to be seen. How long it's going to last? Will it really ever recover its former glory, if that's what it was? I don't know.
Right. I feel like this is the end of NATO. Do you believe so as well? Like, it may exist just for a while longer in terms of just a big money laundering scheme, but as a true defensive alliance, I feel like it's really been shattered through this Ukraine war. It doesn't seem, it didn't serve its function. It's been exposed to be a bit of a paper tiger, and it just shows all the divisions, the problem of these entangling alliances. Of this that the people in France aren't going to want to fight a war for Georgia or Ukraine. Especially if it's something that is being heavily provoked by NATO.
Well, I don't think it's the end of NATO yet, and you could even make the argument that NATO might in the end be strengthened, because saying the big part of the problem was that there really was no credible threat for so many years, ever since the fall of the Soviet Union, and that has helped to hollow out NATO. It's just that people pretended that, okay, we have our militaries, but it's just they're never going to fight. We don't have to really train them. Who cares if this equipment works? As long as we're all making money off of it. I think there's been that kind of attitude for a while, but there's a chance now that, especially if Russia goes marching to Kiev and Odessa and whatever, that the reaction in Europe could lead to a strengthening of NATO. It could happen. I don't see why, it just might say, oh, we have a real enemy now. Now clearly these leaders like Macron and Sterkarmer are trying to make that case now. but they don't seem to be going very far. They've had all these conferences, they've tried to establish the so-called coalition of the willing, but virtually nobody wants to join them in it. Again, it's just that, so.
Do you really think so? Do you think that, NATO could get strengthened through this?
Well, it's possible. It's just theoretically possible. But I mean, I guess you just look at by and large, it seems like most of these countries are, even when you look at France and England, it's just in general, the populaces are not behind this. It's not something, or even the militaries. It was like in the UK, Keir Starmer, he's been one of the most vocal and, about sending troops to Ukraine. But the British military, their generals and admirals, they actually leaked, made some, spoke, to the press. I can't remember. I think it was the Telegraph. It's one of the major leading papers in the UK, and they described it. They described Keir Starmer's rhetoric as just political theater. And they're saying that we just don't have the capability to do this, even to send so-called peacekeeping troops and maintain them there for any length of time. We just don't have it. So, their own militaries, I guess that's part of it. It's just that, they can talk a lot, and some of them can, make these threats, but they can't back them up. I think that's the truth, and often their militaries realize that. And then you just don't find the desire within the population to support these, to make the financial sacrifices, for example. Now the elites are demanding it. They're saying that, okay, we're going to have to cut back, and this is happening, actually, in the UK, where they're cutting fairly basic social services. And I think the same has happened in Germany, and more cuts are threatened. But none of this is, winning votes. It's not winning hearts and minds. So, so far they're not really, they haven't been able to convince their people. Now, maybe that's one reason. If the Russians start marching fast and it just, the front just collapses completely, and there's this real fear, I think it would be unjustified, but a fear that they're just marching all the way to the Polish border, and who knows, they may just keep on going there or something. Perhaps you could start to convince those people, and then perhaps you're going to get a real, there would be an enemy that could just, like the old Soviet enemy that could truly strengthen NATO, give it a purpose again. Right now they pretend like they have a purpose, but it seems like when push comes to shove, they don't really believe it. So yeah, I'm saying theoretically, NATO could be strengthened, but I don't see any signs of that happening yet. It's just talk from certain leaders like Macron and Keir Starmer, and they're always the Baltic states, but they just don't matter. They're just tiny little countries that have always been rabidly anti-Russian.
Right. I don't think that it would ever happen. I just think that one of the biggest weaknesses that was exposed in this Ukraine conflict was the lack of any manufacturing base within the Western world. And that is just crucial if you want to really be a leading military power. And I think that's just something that we've just completely overlooked. Everybody just didn't think about that. I mean, we're seeing it right now happen in the United States with the tariff war that we're trying to bring manufacturing back. And Trump is realizing, hey, it's not that easy. We're seeing it in Europe right now. They're saying, okay, let's stop making BMWs and start making tanks. And they're like, it's not that easy. We can't just flip a switch. We have production lines that need to be created. We need to be able to source all the parts for this. It takes decades to build a real proper manufacturing base. Plus, they've cut themselves off of energy in Europe as well. So that, I think, in itself is almost the death knell for NATO. The fact that they've run out of munitions and they haven't been able to ramp up production, and the cost for them to ramp up production is just so high, and it's such a long time horizon that I just don't see it being politically or economically viable. It's unless they were truly threatened, that they really, really felt like, okay, I need to defend my homeland, then you can really get everybody. You get the Rosie the Riveter spirit, and then,
right.
You get it done. Maybe.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's been more than 3 years. And it's amazing that, at the end of these 3 years, the European military so much work, NATO in general is much weaker than when this conflict began. You would think that, yeah, they would have started ramping up production immediately. They've had, some success, but very minor. Essentially, they have failed. And, after 3 years, now they're talking big. They have plans, again, to recreate the munitions industry in Europe. But, yeah, I'll believe it when I see it. I have my doubts about this.
Yeah, I highly doubt we're going to see it. Well, if NATO does kind of fall apart and we don't really regard the Western Europeans as true allies anymore, or they don't regard us as allies anymore, what happens? Does all these nations, do they start to float around and gravitate to other poles in the multipolar world? And if that's the case, do you think anybody would gravitate towards the U.S. pole? I mean, I feel like the U.S. is isolating itself through all of its actions, through the tariffs and all these conflicts or support of Israel and the genocide in Gaza. We're losing the hearts and minds of people all around the world. So when this multipolar world takes form and we see countries begin to decide, I'm going to park my ship with China and Russia and the BRICS and deal with this, and will we see European countries start doing that? Do you think anybody's going to want to come over to our club? Like our club is the one that failed. It's that's what I'm kind of worried about in the future. I feel like we will be isolated. I feel like it's happening right now, that we become just a loser sitting in the corner, and we deserve it, But what do you think?
Yeah. Well, yeah, potentially. I mean, we're not there yet. The U.S. is still, in so many ways, it's, I don't know if it's truly the global superpower anymore, but it is a global superpower. But
nobody likes it anymore.
Yeah,
it's a global super that nobody likes.
Right. Well, I think, first Biden himself and previous administrations did a lot of damage. But, that was generally, again, it was aimed directly at, Russia and China and Iran. And this time, and there was collateral damage in Europe. I think a lot of the, again, the European people are not happy about the way that Europe has been treated. They've become, I think, or at least many Europeans have been made very much aware of their vassal status, and they understand that they have paid the price, for this Project Ukraine. Even under Biden and the previous administrations, our policies, I think, were losing friends. And certainly, the support of the unconditional support for Israel has damaged our reputation around the world. But this has been exacerbated, of course, by Trump, who hasn't really essentially changed. Maybe we do have seen some improvement in relations. I think it's real enough between the U.S. and Russia, but not between the U.S. and China, not between the U.S. and Iran. The overall policies are still in place, but we've added to that these attacks, on European and other allies, often in the form of tariffs. That's the main thing, but it's more than that. It's just clear. It's clear that Trump does not like the European elites, and he doesn't really hide the fact. He's not very diplomatic about it. That's one thing Trump is not. He's not diplomatic. It's just like I think our overall position in the world has, the decline that preceded Trump is accelerated. And you say, well, possibly within our hemisphere,
the Canadians don't really like us.
Yeah, well, the thing is, you can say, well, with brute force, we've made the Panamanians do some things and the Colombians do some things, because these are very, very weak countries that are quite dependent on us. And so we can throw our weight around and get some things from these people. This is not really a good long-term strategy. Policies or alliances, that are based on fear are not really alliances. You can get countries to bend the knee to you, but they don't love you, and they're probably always looking for a way out. And in countries like Canada, Canada, the joke is that they basically were like the 51st state. Most Americans look at Canadians as just, it's just the backyard of America. And, what's the difference? Now, can you talk to Canadians and they'll insist that it's all very, very different, but I have my own doubts about that. But amazingly, one thing that maybe Trump will end up achieving, ironically, is a real Canadian consciousness and an actual, we may see a Canada that no longer is just a backyard, but that is actually standing up to America. And so, in the end, even in our own hemisphere, I think our position has been weakened.
It seems like, this decline, it just keeps on getting worse, and the decisions we make to try to reverse it just hasten it. What could we do to make it better? How could if you were president, what would you do? Just say, apologize for everything, and the military bases, try to get accepted into the multipolar world and a true international, organizations that aren't just ruled by, the rules-based, world order. What would we do?
Yeah, well, we certainly could. I mean, we can bury the hatchet with Russia and China and Iran. There's actually, I think in all those cases, especially like in the case of Iran and Russia, okay, well, I think in all those cases, it just makes no sense to risk military conflict of any kind. I think there's no question it's not to our advantage. I think maybe you could hash out some sort of trade agreement that would be more favorable to the U.S. with China. But the way Trump is going about that is just not going to be successful, again, for reasons that stated. Just the inconsistency is a big problem. There's no reason. Again, it's not like we would be sacrificing major interests in the case of dealing with Russia. Making Russia the enemy did not make the U.S. any safer, any richer. I think quite the reverse. Making Iran the enemy is the same thing. It would actually be to our advantage if we worked with them, if we traded with them. We actually do have a lot of common interests with both of those countries and with China. It's not that that we actually are. Well, what we're retreating from is not from our own interests. We're not really sacrificing anything material. What we're retreating from is this notion, of us as the world hegemon. That's what we're abandoning. But I think it's just time to abandon it. It's just because it's no longer tenable. It was something that you could believe in and was essentially true in the 90s. But that era has passed, as Marco Rubio himself has said. And we should just let it go. There's just no reason, just hanging on to this is, again, not to our benefit. It just increases the chance of conflict, both economic and military. But
you don't see us letting go?
Well, you see some in a very imperfect and inconsistent way, I think, with Trump. Like we said, he's not a neocon. I don't think he doesn't actually believe in the rules-based international order, but he still kind of believes as America, the exceptional nation. It's this clear, right? And even with his dealings with Russia, a lot of the way that we talk about them, and just the action, this attempt to put together some sort of package, a peace plan, and then just present it to Russia, and they've got to take it or leave it. Again, that's a behavior of a hegemon. It's not the behavior of one power among other powers. You're not looking at them as another sovereign power that has their own interests. If you did have that view, which we actually had during the Cold War, we did negotiate a lot of very helpful treaties because we did respect the Soviet Union, even though we regarded them as the enemy. We did respect them, and we were able to negotiate, these agreements that were beneficial to both sides. But he still seems to have the same attitude in a way that previous administrations have had ever since really the fall of the Soviet Union. It's just that in the end we can dictate terms. We can tell them what the way it's supposed to be. And then if it's, again, we've seen maybe just this, it's just like the beginnings of a change. I guess with all these change in policies, they tend to be they don't happen overnight. I mean, there has been a change in rhetoric. They have actually gone to talk to them, and that's important. But it seems like the old habits still die hard, and at the end of the day, we're still kind of living in that with that old mindset that, again, it's really, there's, it's almost like we're the teacher and the rest of the world are just the students in the classroom. And then we can punish different countries when they misbehave. We actually use that kind of language, and if there's two of the children are squabbling, that we can make them both stand in the corner and make them promise not to do it again. And that's all absurd. You get, again, this kind of language that in reference to the Ukraine war. And it's absurd on its face. I mean, it's just that, Russia is a great power, and Russia is actually defeating you, right, in this war, because this is not just, you're not, a neutral third party. As we know, the U.S. has been very extensively and deeply involved in this war from the start, and, at every level. And you're losing it. And I think you just have to wake up to the fact. It seems like they really haven't.
Right. Yeah, so we need to learn how to let go of the status of the world hegemon, or we'll have an all-out war, and then in order to lose that status, right?
Yeah,
so that's
it
just
would be
the
much
line
better
that,
for us just to let go gracefully, as other great powers have, that did have world empires. The Dutch, for example.
they were graceful.
Yeah, I would say in the case, I don't know the history that well, but yeah, that's the Dutch. The Holland is a very prosperous country. It's a very, very livable country, as you well know. It's not like, that you become, by letting go of this kind of status, by letting go of an empire, that you're just doomed to failure. You'll be among the loser nations. Nobody says that about the Netherlands, right? And, I guess the case of Britain is sort of a mixed bag. I think they've had trouble letting go, and that's part of what we're seeing right now. It's just that they know they can't do it on their own, so they've just attached themselves to the U.S. and they do whatever they can to egg the U.S. on, and the U.S. has been very, very much involved in all levels of operations and intelligence gathering and so on and so forth in Ukraine. So have the Brits, and they work side by side with it, in a way that's disproportionate to their real abilities. But I think it's part of that, because they have trouble too at letting go. In fact, their empire is gone, but they still want to pretend that they are that imperial power, and they do it through their association with the U.S. At least they've done that until recently. Now that the U.S. is sort of looking for a divorce, now they're turning to Europe and offering their leadership. And I think, but then of course you have the French, who they still, I guess the ghost of Napoleon still haunts them, and you see that in Macron. He's offering himself as the leader of Europe.
Yeah, it's interesting. We'll see how this all plays out. But does history, just from your knowledge of history, do you feel like we will more likely be able to bow out gracefully like the Dutch? Or do we have historical examples where it ended in just a huge, horrific bang? I mean, with the case of the Brits, the empire was more like declining, but, we'll pass it on to you, young America, and we will guide you. And they're still part of the empire,
Right.
Yeah,
well, let's see. Okay, we had the Portuguese.
They seem to have faded out, right?
Yeah,
in
right.
general. So could we be hopeful that that's what we'll see here, that
Right.
we won't get embroiled in some massive conflict?
Yeah, no, there wasn't a violent paroxysm, in the case of either Spain. I mean, in the end, they lost their empire, and they faded into second-class status within Europe. But again, they're very livable countries. I mean, people love those countries. It's not like they had to. It fell into the abyss afterwards when they lost their empires. In the case of these traditional empires, I really can't see it.
Should
I
we be
guess,
drawing parallels to traditional empires, or is something
yeah,
that
maybe
the
not.
U.S.
I mean,
has
maybe the
unique?
American empire is something different. One thing it is, and we don't have in general, we don't have direct control over territories. What we have is these various so-called alliances and bases, all throughout the world. Um, it's, we don't, at least publicly, we don't simply issue orders to countries. Now, like WikiLeaks has revealed that we're always twisting arms, even including in Europe. And we do have a great deal of leverage with all these countries. A combination of our soft power and economic power and military power has, allowed us to really kind of dictate policies to countries around the world. And those countries that firmly resist and refuse to go along. And, the best known ones, of course, are Russia, China, and Iran. They become enemies, and they've been able to survive the onslaught because each of those countries is strong enough and powerful enough to stand on their own. They were, in the case of Iran, it pretty much did stand on its own for years, but now they have now they have a lot of company. It's just like I think in the past, like Russia looked at Iran and said, well, this is best not to get involved here. We want to try to maintain good relations with the West. But when the U.S. turned its guns, on Russia, its economic guns, and quite literal, real guns, through its support of Ukraine, Russia understood, well, we're in the same boat. It's time to join hands. So, I think I kind of forgot where I started with this, but that's where I ended.
That's fine. Yeah, I guess just my question is just, do you think that we will end up in a massive conflict? I think that's what's keeping so many people up at night, is that they understand, or they have this deep-seated feeling that they know that the U.S. empire is declining, and it's lashing out and twisting arms and trying to control the world. It's no longer able to.
Yeah.
And so it's starting to act more and more irrational, and then that's scary. And and then we have this crazy country, Israel, that's also just dead set on getting us into a war. So to me, that's the most dangerous spot for us, is because I don't know the power of the full extent of the Israeli lobby and the Zionist control over our government, if they're really able to do this. But do you think that we will be able to bow out gracefully if you're just a betting man, or are we headed for some type of conflict?
Right.
And if
it's hard to say. You almost could call it a fusion with Israel. There's been a melding of identities, not exactly a melding, but it's just sort of like, as John Mearsheimer often describes, we're joined at the hips. We kind of become Siamese twins. And so it's just not going to be easy to separate. I mean, it's not just like, okay, yeah, this isn't working out. Because again, we have so many true believers, both in the government and, among the common people, that this will be very difficult. So it is a very dangerous situation because Israel has become increasingly kind of an apocalyptic cult, or it's a country that is now governed by an apocalyptic cult. We have thrown in our lot with them. Now, like in the case of Iran, we'll have to see what happens. Again, Trump has shown some realism. I think, again, he's not the first one. It's other administrations. Biden, I think, came very close to war with Iran. George W. Bush did. But when they got close, again, I think there are enough people, again, the people that really understand the balance of military power have just told them that this is a very, very bad idea, and they've pulled back. And it looks like Trump is yet another president who's done the same. But it's not over. Again, I think this will be key. If Trump is able to withstand the pressures, which are, are intense and probably will only become more intense over time as if he continues to pursue negotiations, then then, this is not that we have actually divorced Israel, but we have we'll show that we can achieve a degree of independence. Just a degree, just a step back from the abyss, and then maybe maybe not certainly not an actual divorce from Israel, but a slight distancing of the relationship. If we could achieve that, we'll see. I think it's all very, very unclear at this point. It's very doubtful. I mean, again, all of us were quite pleased by the ceasefire that was achieved, through the offices of Witkoff and who was working as Trump's envoy. But then they broke it. It fell apart, and it fell apart with our blessing, and just a couple of months later. So we seem to be off to a good start with Iran, but we've seen good starts end very, very badly already. There is this lack of consistency, again, and I think in the case of the Middle East in general, it's not just a lack of consistency. There is a real question about whether or not, there really is goodwill. In the end, do they really want peace? I'm not sure that they really do. Maybe if they can get it cheaply, they'll go for it, but they may not make the sacrifices, or they may not persist, which is, again, to hammer out these agreements, it takes time. It takes, persistence. It takes patience. And I don't know if those are qualities that you really would associate with Trump. And maybe that he'll get frustrated with the Iranians at some point and do a 180. Or just tear it all up.
Right. Yeah. And if any deal that maybe is met between America and Iran, I'm sure that it won't satisfy Netanyahu. Netanyahu would be satisfied with, right. So what could Israel do? What could Netanyahu do other than we talked about actually trying to attack on its own, and then that help that they drag the United States in after Israel's attack? Is there anything like what kind of powers and pressures do they have to?
Well, again, they have
Trump's
a lot
opinion?
of. I mean, again, these mega donors, but more than that, there are really, let's say, passionate Israel supporters just throughout the administration, but also, the permanent bureaucracy. So he has a lot of leverage to push, and he has, AIPAC, and he has the other lobbies within the U.S. He has his friends in the media. He has a lot of levers that he can pull on.
So do you think that if we do get some agreement, there's a good chance we'll renege on it, just like we did the last JCPOA?
Well, yeah, I think there is. I mean, again, it was Obama actually, he just immediately failed to do his part of it. It wasn't just the fact that Trump tore it up, but Obama failed to lift the sanctions. And that was part of the deal. And, the Iranians have to be aware of that. Again, they just might go in and do this and say, oh, these people are probably going to cheat, but we'll do this, and that'll just keep them off our backs for a while, like I was saying. And,
Well, what happens if they cheat? If they cheat, then what does that do? I mean, further loss of face internationally, right, for the Americans.
It should. That should be the result.
You can't make agreements with the Americans anymore.
Right.
They always cheat on it.
Yeah, I think in the past, I mean, again, that like most of the world kind of just wasn't really looking closely. And then if the Americans condemned Iran, and again, the Europeans were supposed to be guarantors of the JCPOA, and they failed completely. They did not do their part either, and the Iranians saw all this. But it was just at that time, it was just that the U.S. had all the power, including the soft power, and the Iranians had none. So you can just kind of do what you wanted to Iran, and there didn't seem to be any consequences. But again, the world has changed. Again, Iran has friends that it didn't have before, and the U.S. soft power has declined. So it'll be more difficult. I mean, yeah, okay, if we walk away, within the U.S., within the U.S. echo chamber, and with our Western allies, probably they'll put the blame on Iran somehow, which is what they've always done in the past. But it's not going to So I don't think it's going to be convincing again for the rest of the world.
Yeah. I feel like if you say that we're joined at the hip with Israel, then eventually we're going to be headed to some type of all-out war. Because I just don't see Israel looking into the future. I just don't see them stopping what they're doing in Gaza and the West Bank, and it's going to incite some type of pushback from their neighbors. They'll continue into Lebanon and Syria. Zionism, I feel like, is dying, and I just feel like the U.S. will be dying with it. That's kind of the scary part.
Yeah, no, I think that's certainly true. I mean, there's a real chance of that. This again, I think it's going to end very badly for Israel, but the bad end for Israel will likely involve us. Again, we're far away, but it will be a humiliation. Maybe.
It's so frustrating. It's so crazy. There's no reason for this. I don't understand how. I don't even want to ask you the question, because I always ask you, like, how did it get to this point where the Israel lobby and the Zionists have so much control over my country that we can just make such irrational decisions that are not in the interest of the United States at all, that are destroying the United States, that is destroying the United States.
Yeah.
It's just mind-boggling to me. And we just got to sit and watch it happen, and get called anti-Semites for it.
Yeah, right. Right. I mean, yeah, it's very frustrating. Again, like we've said before, there are trends that are encouraging. There is a real shift in public opinion, especially among younger people, both conservative and liberal. Both Republican leaning and Democrat leaning, and that bodes well for the future. And it's got to be very alarming for the Israel firsters. Their reign will come to an end, so there is a chance, again, I think, like I've said, I think what we can really hope for is, I'm afraid it's going to come too late to save Gaza or the Palestinians, but we can hope for, with regard to the U.S. relationship to Israel, is that there will be eventually, that the Zionist influence will be driven from this government. It may take a whole another generation. Hopefully it won't be that long. Again, it seems like Israel's own actions is accelerating the trend. And maybe instead of being a generation, it could be 5 or 10 years or something. But we do see a real dramatic shift away from Israel and in favor of the Palestinians, that I think is just bound to have an impact on this country. And if we can change our policy, that would be the best thing of all. Maybe we're looking for a way to gracefully bow out. I think that's something we can hope for. It's not impossible, but it's going to be, the years ahead, the months ahead are a real minefield, because that old power is still very much in control, and they're just not going to let go. It's until they're forced out, through maybe a series of elections or something. That's the best that we could hope for, but it's just not going to happen right away. In the meantime, I think that as they sense that the end may be coming, that Zionism is in real danger, that they may become increasingly reckless. And I think that's what we're seeing already in Israel.
Right. What would happen to Israel if the United States wasn't there backing it up?
That would be the end. I mean, there's just no way that Israel could maintain all these, this hostile.
It would cease to exist as a state, or would they be forced to somehow normalize? Do you think there's a chance that they could normalize? There would be
real, that's what they would be looking at. If we really did, if we cut all, said not another bullet, you guys got to end this. You got to make peace. You got to have achieve the 2-state solution. Well, there would be tremendous pressure. And that's the thing, is like everybody in power in Israel now is just very much devoted to Zionism, to an expanding Israel. And, you talk about the 2-state solution, of course, they're 800,000 settlers in the West Bank, and the plans are to reintroduce settlers into Gaza. It's clear, that's actually, they're getting ready to do that. And it's just that, these people, okay, they're not all fanatics, but a lot of them are. And And Israel has nuclear bombs. Who knows what they would do? Again, if the U.S. does cut that support, that may be the ultimate blackmail. Is that when it comes down to it, where we finally said, okay, we've had it with you guys, we're cutting support, and they say, well, we've got these bombs that we're going to set off if you do that. I'm just throwing that out there, but I don't think that's completely ridiculous. And just
do you think they have bombs hidden around the world?
I don't think so. I can't say that that's not possible. Of course, anything's possible. I haven't heard any such reports.
Yeah, I mean, it seems ridiculous, but that pager attack was also just
took everybody by surprise.
Took everybody by surprise, and I think that's got to be pretty damaging as well to Israel. It's like, like you said, you can't just rule by fear, and that's kind of their strategy. Is that who knows, we might blow you up, because like that's it's pretty pretty dark.
It is. But that again, that's the direction that Israel is moving in. I think before, like if you certainly went back to the years following the 1967 Six-Day War, the support for Israel's image, especially in the Western world, there was a lot of anger, in the Arab world and much of the Third World, about that war. But in the U.S. in particular, and much of the Western world, I think there was a real, widely felt admiration for Israel. And it's still there. It's kind of become increasingly cultish. I think over time, Israel would would be described as the most moral army in the world, and I think that was always absurd. But it wasn't such a ridiculous statement back then. I mean, there was genuine admiration by reasonable people of Israel, back in the 60s and 70s and 80s, and now it's simply fear, on the part of Israel's enemies, and then there's this kind of cultish devotion to it. People who believe in this apocalyptic cult. And then there's just, frankly, this very ugly celebration of violence. I think that's something that comes out of the neocons. Again, I think I told you, it was part of one of the reasons that the neocons admired Israel is that, they didn't show restraint. And they wanted the U.S. to go down the same path, and we're seeing that starting to happen. It's just sort of like, a celebration of violence. All those things are coming together. But, it has a powerful hold on certain people, a lot of people in this country, and certainly people within Israel. But it looks very, very ugly to the rest of the world.
For sure. Jeffrey Sachs makes it sound like if the United States just didn't veto the two-state solution, veto the recognition of the Palestinians as an own state in the UN, then if we just did that, then everything should be all right. Do you believe that? Is there any? Yeah, is that possible? Is it two-state solution?
I love Jeffrey Sachs. He's a wonderful man, but I just don't see that as a real option at this point. It's just that.
What would happen if the U.S. did? Like, let's just say that, okay, we didn't veto it, and then we say, okay, we recognize Palestine as a state. What does that mean? What happens?
Right. Well, there would be tremendous anger within Israel, and they just might respond by lashing out further and, creating facts on the ground, which they've already have, of which there are many already. And
creating what?
Facts on the ground. It's just, in other words, say, the fact is that you've seen the maps of Israel, and the portion that's actually, of the West Bank that's actually under Palestinian control has been shrinking steadily since 1967. And now it's much less than half. They're just little green dots, where there used to be a solid green patch that's been broken up into very small dots. And then we're seeing the same thing happen in Gaza right now. I mean, Gaza, again, it always suffered, but it was a contiguous Palestinian territory. And that was one thing that Gaza had going for it. But the Israelis, part of what they're doing right now is that they're breaking it up. They're giving it the West Bank treatment. And, they're creating facts on the ground. You mean the UN can do this? Now, the U.S. would have to back it up. There have been UN resolutions. Like there was a UN the Minsk Agreement was codified through a UN resolution. and we just ignored it. The signatories, Ukraine, France, Germany, just ignored it. Quite plainly sabotaged it. And so we could vote for it, and just, if we don't back it up with real action, that doesn't mean anything. If we did back it up, that would mean like no more munitions and maybe, economic sanctions and that kind of thing. And Israel, being a very small, independent country, wouldn't be able to last very long. But I mean, it's just the extremism, the people like Ben Gvir, these Kahanists that actually rule in larger and larger, more and more sectors of Israeli society. Again, they were once on the fringe, and now they control the police. Now the settlers were were few and far between back there in the early 70s, and now they control most of the West Bank. And these people are gonna, they're like the ultranationalists in Ukraine. They're just not gonna. It may not make any sense. It may not be in their own interests, but they are going to fight to the death, and they do have nuclear weapons. So I think it's a very, very scary situation. I just don't think that there was a time when what Jeffrey Sachs said was true. I think if back in the 70s and even through the 80s, maybe, if we had really meant what we said. We've always said that we've been in favor of a two-state solution, but we didn't really mean it. That's the truth. But if we had put some real muscle behind it, then perhaps it could have been achieved back then. I just think that day has passed now.
Okay, so no two-state solution possible. So then that means even if we withdraw support in some way, the likelihood of Israel normalizing relations with its neighbors is pretty much non-existent, you would say, especially with all these settlers that are in the West Bank, right? That it's not going to disappear. So then what we're looking at is what the only thing would be the destruction of the state of Israel, right? That's where this is all heading. At some point,
it could. Yeah, I mean, it seems.
Is there any other solution? I mean,
well, there's a chance that people will come to their senses, and I just don't see it, though. I just don't see it.
So if that's what we're banking on, massive reform, all 800,000 settlers in the West Bank say, "Oops, sorry, we shouldn't have done this. We're going to pack up and we're going to move into Tel Aviv or Haifa or something."
I can see it happening again, for the reasons that we gave within the U.S. over the course of years. That seems to be the trend. A lot of people are waking up, but I just don't see it happening in Israel and everything. Actually, the trend is all going the other way. If at some point we begin to see that there is a large sector of Israeli society, and that has really woken up to the reality and does really renounce Zionism and is looking for truly to live as a normal nation in that part of the world. Those people existed in the past and they had some power, but now they're just. Those people are so few they just, for all practical purposes, don't exist in Israel.
It's so crazy to me that Israel would always be so resistant to a two-state solution, because to me, this is clearly the only way that Israel could survive. It has to, if you want to be here, you have to make friends with your neighbor. Not have to make friends, but you can't continually expand.
Right.
You can't continually invade your neighbors' countries and take their homes and just and expect that that'll be okay. It's just insane that they didn't want a two-state solution.
Yeah.
You guys, all right, congrats, you won the 1967 war or whatever. You took huge swaths of land that didn't belong to you. You got a modern colonial experiment, and you captured a territory. Okay, it was wrong, and we'll have to hash out some things, I'm sure, in the future. But you could exist as a state if they stood there and they stopped and they tried to establish good relations with all their neighbors and trade and be a good neighbor instead of just constantly building up walls and shooting people.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah. Again, I think you do have to point the finger at the U.S. as being absolutely instrumental in all this, because is that faction, that refusal to consider the two-state solution was really only made possible by the U.S. The Israelis began to understand that the U.S. is not serious about the two-state solution, that they, in fact, they support this expansion into these territories. The Zionism is very much alive, which means a continual expansion, and so all those factions, which were already quite powerful within Israel, they had the backing of the U.S. and those smaller and weaker factions that opposed, the expansions of the West Bank, they were weakened by the fact that the U.S. wasn't backing them up. And so I think over time, if the U.S. had been firm and been actually honest about, their commitment to the two-state solution, and they backed it up, Israel could have turned out to be a different place too, just like Ukraine could have turned out to be a different place. It was because, I think, of the support that was thrown to these, the more extreme members. The Zionists, the expansionists within Israel, and the ultranationalists in Ukraine, that these became, in large part, I don't think it's possible without that U.S. support over all those years. They wouldn't have become the dominant powers, because they would have been staring at this reality. It's just that, hey, we're kind of a weak country, and the U.S. has conditioned their support on our support for a two-state solution. Hey, let's be realistic. Let's achieve it. They never had to make that choice. And in fact, it was the people who clearly always wanted to seize the West Bank. Those are the people that ended up in the ascendancy.
Scary stuff, Dad. And it seems like from what you're saying that the ability to course correct is really not there. It's very difficult at this stage.
It's very difficult. We have it. History is full of surprises, and maybe, that there are maybe leaders in the future who can perform miracles. I just don't see them now.
We need to get you in the Oval Office, Dad. Start calling the shots. Okay. All right. Well, I think we can end it there.
Okay.
Have a good rest of your day, Dad.
Yeah, you too.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.